Have you ever been terrified of the person who was supposed to keep you safe? Not because they were cruel, but because you never knew which version of them would walk through the door. I have, and that person was my father. He came home from the war in 1945, but the man my mother married never came back. And I spent my entire childhood trying to understand why. It was a Wednesday afternoon in May 1962. I was 14 years old, standing in the school auditorium at Lincoln High School in Detroit, Michigan. It was the annual Veterans Day assembly, and they'd invited fathers who'd served to come speak to the students about their experiences. My father had been asked. The principal had called our house, spoken to my mother, said it would be wonderful if Sergeant Thomas Brennan could share his story. My mother had hesitated. I heard her on the phone, heard that long pause before she said, "I'll ask him." He said, "Yes." I don't know why. Maybe he thought he could do it. Maybe he wanted to be the man everyone expected him to be. Maybe for one moment he believed he could talk about the war without falling apart. So there we were. The auditorium was filled with 500 students, teachers, parents. The smell of floor polish and adolescent anxiety hung in the air. The principal was at the podium, introducing the veterans. My father was sitting on the stage with 6 other men, all wearing their old uniforms, or at least their service pins. He looked smaller than usual, his shoulders tight, his hands gripping his knees. When they called his name, he stood up, walked to the microphone. The auditorium went quiet. He opened his mouth to speak, and nothing came out. He just stood there, staring at all those faces, his own face going white, then red, then white again. 30 seconds passed, a minute. Students started whispering. Someone giggled nervously. And then my father's hands started shaking. His whole body started shaking. He backed away from the microphone, stumbled off the stage, and walked straight out of the auditorium. Just left. The principal tried to recover, said something about how difficult it was to speak about service, called up the next veteran. But I sat there in the 3rd row, surrounded by my classmates, and I felt my face burn with shame so deep, I thought I might disappear into the floor. After the assembly, in the hallway, Jessica Martinez, who sat behind me in English class, said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Your dad's a coward, isn't he?" My dad says if you can't talk about the war, you probably didn't really fight. I didn't say anything. I just walked away. Because what could I say? That my father woke up screaming every night? That he couldn't sit in restaurants because he needed to see all the exits? That sometimes he stared at nothing for hours and couldn't hear us calling his name? That I loved him and was terrified of him in equal measure? I couldn't explain any of that, so I stayed silent, and the silence felt like betrayal. But that was only the beginning. Before I tell you why that moment changed everything, let me take you back. Because you need to understand who my father was before I was born. Who he was before the war. Because I only know him as the broken version, but my mother remembers the whole man. And she's told me his story so many times I can almost see him the way she did. Thomas Brennan grew up in Detroit, born in 1922, the son of Irish immigrants who worked in the auto factories. He was the youngest of 5 children, and by all accounts, he was the gentle one. The one who helped his mother in the garden. The one who read books and wrote poetry. The one who wanted to be a teacher. He met my mother, Catherine, at a church dance in 1940. She was 17, he was 18. She said he was the kindest person she'd ever met. That he danced like he was apologizing to the floor. That he made her laugh. That when he proposed to her in 1941, she didn't hesitate. They got married in June of 1941. 5 months later, Pearl Harbor was attacked. By February of 1942, my father had enlisted in the army. He was sent to basic training, then to England, then to North Africa. He fought in the Italian campaign. He was at Anzio, at Monte Cassino, places I'd only learn about years later when I tried to understand what had happened to him. He was promoted to sergeant. He led men into battle. He watched friends die. He killed people. Young men, probably as scared as he was, wearing different uniforms but carrying the same fear. He came home in November of 1945. My mother was waiting at the train station, wearing the blue dress he'd said he loved in his letters. She told me she almost didn't recognize him. He'd lost 30 pounds. His eyes were different. Empty in a way that frightened her. When he hugged her, he held on too tight and not tight enough at the same time. Like he was afraid she'd vanish if he let go, but also afraid he'd break her if he held on. And that was the moment I stopped being who they thought I was. I wasn't born until 1948, 3 years after he came home. My mother said those first years were the hardest, that he couldn't work steadily, that he'd get jobs and lose them because he couldn't handle the noise of the factory floor or the crowds of the lunchroom, that he had nightmares so violent he once threw her out of bed in his sleep, thinking she was an enemy, that he drank to silence the memories, then stopped drinking and the memories got louder, that she learned to live in the spaces between his episodes, to be grateful for the good days and endure the bad ones. By the time I was born, they'd found a kind of rhythm. He worked as a night watchman at a warehouse, a job where he could be alone, where the silence was expected. My mother worked as a secretary during the day. They traded shifts like they were trading time zones, rarely in the same room, rarely having to confront what their marriage had become. And then there was me, Margaret Ann Brennan, born into a house where the past was more present than the present itself. I don't remember learning to be quiet. I think I was born knowing. You develop instincts when you grow up with someone whose moods are unpredictable. You learn to read faces, to measure breathing, to assess danger before it becomes visible. I learned that sudden noises were bad, that questions about the war were forbidden, that doors slamming or cars backfiring or fireworks on the 4th of July could send my father into rages or silences that lasted days. I learned to walk softly, to speak softly, to make myself small enough that I wouldn't trigger whatever war was still being fought inside his head. Have you ever felt something like this? That constant vigilance? That exhaustion of monitoring someone else's invisible wounds? My childhood was strange. There were moments of normalcy. My father teaching me to ride a bike on a Saturday afternoon when the light was soft and his mind was clear. My mother making Sunday dinners, the three of us sitting at the table like a real family, passing potatoes and pretending everything was fine. But there were also the other moments. The nights I'd wake up to him screaming. The times he'd disappear for hours and my mother would find him sitting in his car in the driveway, staring at nothing. The Sunday when we tried to go to church and he had a panic attack in the middle of the service and we had to leave, my mother making excuses while I burned with embarrassment. I loved my father, but I was also ashamed of him. And I was ashamed of being ashamed. It's a specific kind of pain, loving someone and wishing they were different, wanting to defend them and also wanting to distance yourself from them. I'd see other fathers at school events, laughing and comfortable, and I'd feel this hollow ache in my chest. Why couldn't my father be like that? Why couldn't he just be normal? The incident at the school assembly wasn't the first time I'd been humiliated by his condition, but it was the most public. After that day, I started lying. When people asked about my father, I'd say he was busy, that he worked nights, that he was private. I stopped inviting friends over. I stopped joining clubs that required parent involvement. I made myself invisible, just like I'd been taught to do at home. And my mother never said anything. She was too busy managing her own survival, her own quiet heroism of staying married to a man who'd been replaced by his trauma. I didn't know it yet, but the world was about to change. The shift came slowly, starting in the late 1960s. I was in college by then, studying at Wayne State University, living in a dorm, finally breathing air that didn't taste like vigilance. The Vietnam War was raging, and suddenly everyone was talking about what war did to soldiers. Protesters were in the streets. Veterans were coming home and speaking publicly about trauma, about flashbacks, about the impossibility of reintegrating into normal life. And I started reading. I started understanding. I learned terms like post-traumatic stress and combat fatigue and survivor's guilt. I learned that what was wrong with my father had a name. That he wasn't weak or broken or cowardly. He was injured. Invisibly, permanently injured. I went home one weekend in 1970. I was 22 years old. I found my father in the garage, organizing tools, which was what he did when he needed to feel in control. I stood in the doorway and I said, "Dad, I've been reading about the war, about what it does to people. And I think I understand now." He didn't look at me, just kept sorting screws into jars, but his hands stopped shaking. And he said, very quietly, "I tried to be the father you deserved. I'm sorry I couldn't." I started crying, not sad crying, relief crying. Because for the first time in my life, we were acknowledging the truth. "You were exactly the father I needed," I said. "I just didn't know how to see it. Stay with me until the end. It's worth it." That conversation didn't fix anything. It didn't erase the years of fear or shame or confusion. But it opened a door. My father and I started talking carefully at first, then more honestly. He told me small pieces of his story. About the morning at Anzio when his best friend was killed by artillery, his body blown apart so completely there was nothing to send home. About the Italian village where they'd been ordered to clear buildings, and he had to shoot a 16-year-old boy who'd been armed with his grandfather's hunting rifle. About the sound of men screaming for medics, a sound that lived in his head every moment of every day. About the guilt of surviving when better men had died. And I told him my story. About growing up afraid. About the school assembly. About Jessica Martinez calling him a coward. About how much I'd loved him even when I didn't understand him. About how I was sorry for being ashamed. About how I wished I'd been braver, wiser, kinder. My mother joined these conversations sometimes. She'd sit with us at the kitchen table and we'd drink coffee and talk about the life we'd lived together. The hard parts and the good parts. The ways we'd all survived. And my father would say things like, "I wanted to give you a normal childhood." And my mother would say, "We did the best we could with what we had." And I'd realize that healing wasn't about going back and changing the past. It was about looking at the past honestly and choosing to carry it differently. My father died in 1998. He was 76 years old. Lung cancer, quick and brutal. At his funeral, the WW did a 21-gun salute, and I watched my mother flinch at every shot, her body still trained to associate gunfire with his trauma. The priest talked about sacrifice and service, and I thought about how those words were too clean for what my father had experienced. How the real story of war isn't found in parades or monuments. It's found in kitchens where men sit at 3 a.m., unable to sleep. In marriages held together by sheer stubborn love. In children who grow up navigating minefields that exist only in their fathers' minds. I'm 67 years old now. I teach history at a community college in Ann Arbor. I specialize in oral histories of veterans and their families. I interview people who lived what I lived, who grew up in the shadow of wars they never fought. And I've learned something important. Trauma doesn't stay contained in one person. It spreads, it touches everyone in proximity. The wives who become caregivers and managers and buffers. The children who learn fear before they learn language. The grandchildren who inherit unnamed silences. War doesn't just kill soldiers. It kills the people those soldiers might have been. And it injures the people who love them. But I've also learned something else. That love is possible even in the wreckage. That my father, despite everything, gave me things I carry forward. His gentleness on good days. His quiet courage in continuing to live when living hurt. His refusal to let his pain turn him cruel, even when cruelty might have been easier. And most importantly, his honesty at the end. His willingness to finally say, "I'm sorry, I tried. I failed sometimes. But I tried." Share this with someone who would understand. Someone who grew up with a veteran parent. Someone who knows what it means to love someone haunted. I think about that school assembly sometimes. About standing in that auditorium, watching my father flee, feeling that crushing shame. And I wish I could go back and tell my 14-year-old self what I know now. That her father's breakdown wasn't weakness. It was the visible crack in a dam that had been holding back an ocean of horror for 17 years. That his inability to speak wasn't cowardice. It was the human mind protecting itself from revisiting unbearable experiences. That the real bravery wasn't in telling war stories. It was in getting up every morning and trying to be a father, a husband, a human being, when every cell in his body was still fighting a war that had ended decades ago. And I'd tell that girl something else, that it was okay to be scared. That it was okay to be ashamed, even though shame wasn't warranted. That she was a child trying to make sense of adult trauma, and she did the best she could. That she didn't fail her father. The world failed him. The system that sent him to war and then expected him to come home unchanged. The society that called him a hero but offered no help when the nightmare started. The culture that equated silence with strength and asking for help with weakness. My father survived the war, but he spent the rest of his life dying from it. Just very, very slowly. And I survived my father. But it took me decades to understand that survival isn't the same as healing. That you can make it through something and still carry it forever. That loving someone doesn't mean fixing them. Sometimes it just means bearing witness. Standing beside them in the dark and saying, "I see you. I see what this cost you." And I'm still here. Truth does not shout. It simply waits to be heard. There's a photograph I keep on my desk. It's from my 10th birthday. My father is in the background, slightly out of focus, watching me blow out candles. He's not smiling, but his face is soft, present. And I remember that moment. How he'd been having a good week. How he'd helped my mother bake the cake. How he'd wrapped my present himself carefully with corners folded just right. How he'd sung happy birthday in his quiet voice. How, for those few hours, the war had loosened its grip just enough for him to be the father he wanted to be. That's who he was. Not the broken man at the assembly. Not the screaming presence in the night. But also not the young soldier in his wedding photo, smiling and whole. He was both and neither. He was a man doing his best to live in a body that had become a war zone. And he was my father, complicated and damaged and real. And I loved him, not despite his trauma. Not because of it. Just loved him. The way you love family, unconditionally, imperfectly, completely. I teach my students now about the real cost of war. Not just in casualties and budgets, but in the decades that follow. In the children who inherit their parents' nightmares. In the marriages that survive or don't. In the ordinary moments made extraordinary by invisible wounds. In the courage it takes to live when living is hard. In the love that persists even when connection feels impossible. And I tell them about my father. Not as a hero, not as a victim, but as a human being who went to war and came back changed. Who struggled every day to be present for the people he loved. Who failed sometimes and succeeded sometimes and kept trying until he couldn't anymore. Who taught me without meaning to that strength isn't about perfection. It's about endurance. About showing up even when showing up is the hardest thing you'll do that day. Respect does not erase the past. It simply teaches us how to breathe again. If stories like this remind you what dignity feels like, subscribe. You belong here. And don't miss the next story. It is something truly unforgettable.